Welcome to the Sprout Out Loud podcast. I'm your host, Allie McGowan, a registered dietitian on a mission to help others navigate confusing nutrition information. Each week, we'll explore practical strategies for improving metabolic health and building lifestyle habits that support lasting change. My goal is to equip you with the tools and insights to take control of your health and make informed choices that work for you. Before I jump in, just a heads up, there was definitely some construction happening while I was recording this podcast, so I apologize in advance for any background noise that you may hear towards the end of this episode. Welcome back to the Sprout Out Loud podcast. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that comes up in a lot of my visits, and it's just a topic that I feel like a lot of people struggle with, and it affects their eating behaviors and maybe sort of stands in the way of them reaching their nutrition-related goals, and that is emotional eating. I'm going to talk about the difference between emotional hunger and physical hunger. We're going to talk about what may make someone more susceptible to emotional eating. So for example, if you feel like this is something that I struggle with, but someone around me or other people around me don't have this same experience, and what is wrong with me? Well, spoiler alert, there are certainly some factors that may make someone more susceptible to emotional eating. We'll talk about what some of those biological explanations are, what happens, on a functional level when we stress eat or emotionally eat, how this may feel in our body. Sometimes people will say, I don't think I have an issue with stress or emotional eating. And then we talk more about it and they may sort of say, oh, actually, that description resonates with me, and maybe this is something that I didn't realize was affecting me. We'll talk about how stress and emotional eating may affect someone's relationship with food. It can cause, feelings of guilt or shame, may cause some distrust with our body, and how to sort of address that. If you're someone who would like more support in this area, I do have a resource that sort of focuses on the emotional regulation toolkit component. So it's going to walk you through how to build that emotional regulation toolkit that I talk about later in the episode. But I am also considering a mini course on this topic if you'd like an additional layer. So if this is of interest to you, whether you're interested in the resource that I have or you're interested in a more in-depth mini course, please reach out. You can message me on Instagram at Sprout Out Loud. That's one word, SPROUTOUTLOUD. Or you can shoot me an email. My email address is Allie, A-L-I, at sproutoutloud.com, and let me know if that would be of interest to you. Okay, so first off, what is emotional eating? Emotional eating is really eating in response to emotions. So this would look like eating even though we are not physically hungry as a means to cope with emotions. And a lot of times I think people hear this term and they think that this is just related to negative emotions. So stress, anxiety, so on and so forth. But emotional eating can also be eating in celebration, right? So if we are celebrating a birthday or an event, maybe we're not physically hungry, but we are eating in response to that event or as part of a celebration, well then we could technically call that emotional eating. And I share this not to make anyone hyper aware of their eating behaviors. I share this actually to sort of maybe neutralize this term and say that emotional eating isn't an inherently bad thing, right? It's not bad to celebrate with food. Food serves many functions beyond just, the utilitarian need of satisfying hunger. What I'm focusing on today is how emotional eating can become problematic if it is the only tool that we have in our toolkit to address our emotions. And if we are sort of getting in the way of our health-related goals, or if this behavior is sort of affecting our life in a negative way. So first, misconception around emotional eating is that it's always bad. It's definitely not always bad. It would be unrealistic as humans for us to expect that we would only ever eat if we were hungry. And so again, we want to not necessarily remove eating from our emotional regulation toolkit, thinking about all of the life celebrations that we have had historically and we will have in our future, but rather we want to sort of expand our toolkit to have other means to regulate our emotions in addition to using food. And so, emotional eating is often associated with feelings of guilt, and it can become problematic if it leads to things like adverse effects on our health. So I want to pause here, and I also just want to say that emotional eating is not the same thing as binge eating or binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder is actually a clinical eating disorder, meaning that there are certain clinical criteria that would classify someone as having binge eating disorder. And even binge eating disorder is not the same as just overeating, right? It's a separate category of behaviors that it is important to sort of parse out from these bouts of overeating in response to emotions. So the two are not the same, and I'm not going to dive into binge eating disorder too much in this episode, but just know that sometimes these terms get thrown around, and a little bit of nuance can really just help us approach this topic or approach this behavior correctly. Okay, so what is the difference between physical hunger and emotional hunger? This can be super helpful if we're sort of unsure if we are eating in response to emotions. So physical hunger is going to sort of occur gradually. It's going to be something that builds slowly, and it's going to relate to, the last time that we ate, as well as the composition of our meal. So if we just ate and we had a nice balanced meal, it's probably going to take a little bit of time for us to start to gradually feel that hunger coming back, right? So we may satisfy our physical hunger with sort of any food. If we're physically hungry, we might, I don't want to say take whatever's around, but we're not going to have a specific desire for a taste or a texture or an experience. We're just going to be like, oh, I'm hungry. And that experience is going to end after we eat. So we're physically hungry, we eat, that hunger passes. And typically this experience is not associated with feelings of guilt or shame because we know that we need to eat for our survival. And we all want to survive. Emotional eating is a little bit different because it is not going to occur gradually, and it is not going to be related to the last time that we ate or what we ate. Instead, emotional eating is going to come on suddenly, and it's going to feel pretty urgent. This experience may happen independent of the last time that we ate, even if we ate recently and even if we had a nice balanced meal. It's also typically going to come with cravings for like a specific taste or texture or food. So for example, all of a sudden I just need something crunchy or salty or savory or smooth or sweet and salty. And this hunger may not always be satisfied with eating, right? So we might be physically full. We might maybe have any one of these foods that we're craving, and we may still want to continue eating. And so the desire to eat despite fullness may indicate that the eating isn't actually satisfying whatever underlying hunger is happening. And this is where sort of understanding the emotional experience can be very, very helpful. Emotional hunger is also often associated with feelings of guilt or shame. And so after the experience, we might look back, we might think, why did I eat that? I wasn't even hungry. And I think the thing to mention here is that we didn't address the emotion. So in addition to feeling maybe guilt or shame around what we just ate, whatever emotion that led us to emotionally eat is still there. And so now we have the emotional experience that wasn't necessarily addressed. And then we have this layer of guilt and shame, which may then just extend the emotional experience. And some people will say, then they just want to emotionally eat again. And so this can be a very limiting and distressing cycle for some people. And understanding where the emotions are coming from can be really helpful to break this cycle. And it's not necessarily easy. I'm not saying that this is a really easy thing to do, but we do need to sort of create some pause, and we need to sort of interrupt this pattern in order to create a new pattern. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Another thing to sort of call out here is that the cravings that we may experience as part of stress and emotional eating, those are going to be different from cravings that we may experience due to imbalanced blood sugar levels throughout the day. And so really when we think about stress eating or emotional eating, this is going to happen if we can check the box on, okay, I have eaten enough. Okay, my meals are balanced. Okay, my meals are supporting good blood sugar control. and I'm still having these specific cravings in response to an emotional state. And so this is where working with a dietitian or someone who's knowledgeable in these topics can be really helpful to parse out the difference between what is happening on an emotional level versus a physiological level, so that we can create an approach that addresses the root cause of these behaviors and of these cravings. So without getting into the science too much, I think it can be helpful to just know that there are certain biological explanations for why we may be driven to eat after a stressful or emotional experience. And so just very quickly, when we are experiencing a stressor, a lot of times the body is actually going to suppress our appetite so that we can get through that stressful event. So if you imagine that you're being chased by a bear, your body is going to prioritize things like releasing energy quickly, ensuring that you can see clearly. It's going to sort of prioritize your survival mechanisms and deprioritize anything that isn't essential in that moment. So if we were in this really stressful, like life-threatening event, we're probably not going to be thinking, what's for lunch? We're probably going to be thinking, shoo, I got to get out of the situation as fast as possible. And that is why sometimes some people may experience significant appetite suppression when they are going through a particularly stressful event. And now some people may say, no, for me, when I'm going through a stressor, I actually have a larger appetite. And so when we go through a stressful event, if we experience that appetite suppression, certain hormones will then sort of rise after we get through that event. And these hormones are going to actually stimulate our appetite and encourage us to eat. So this sort of mechanism of down-regulating your appetite and then up-regulating it after you've gone through the stressful event helps to ensure your survival so that you're making it through that stressful event, and then reward you for getting through that stressful event. And that's where we may experience this increase in appetite afterwards. Now, if our stress is chronic and if it is always going unmanaged, then the levels of the hormones that rise after a stressful event may actually just stay elevated. And so this could lead to chronically stimulated eating behaviors. In other words, this could lead to an appetite that is just sort of chronically elevated. And so this is where stress management can be very, very helpful. And then in addition to that, if we just think about what happens on a functional level, when we're stressed, certain studies suggest that our executive function may be slightly deactivated. And executive function really just describes sort of the mental skills that help us to plan, focus our attention, think before acting, and sort of juggle a number of tasks. And so if things like, following recipes or making decisions around food or eating slowly and mindfully feels really difficult during a stressful time, you're not alone. This might just be executive function sort of taking a back seat during a stressful period. Okay, so if you feel like I really struggle with this, but other people in my family don't struggle with this, or my friends don't struggle with this, like what is wrong with me? I just want to say that there's nothing wrong with you. There are a number of physiological, physical, mental, emotional, behavioral, and social causes that can actually increase the likelihood of someone emotional eating. And so I'm going to go through these quickly at a high level without getting into them too much. So the first factor that I'll mention is actually dieting. Research shows that restrained eating, which is voluntarily restricting food as a means to control our body weight, is a consistent predictor of overeating under stress. And one of the explanations as to why restrained eaters may develop these feelings or develop this response is due to, intense deprivation, which could lead them to sort of abandon their diet during stressful periods. And this is not to say that you have to be a restrained eater in order to experience stress or emotional eating. This is just saying that this sort of behavior may exacerbate stress or emotional eating. Okay, next. Maybe we're not feeling super deprived as it relates to our diet. Maybe we're not really a restrained eater, but if we are feeling feelings of deprivation in other areas of our life, this could lead to people seeking fulfillment through food instead. The other thing to note about dieting is that dieting may prevent us from really tapping into our hunger and fullness cues. And so if we are a restrained eater, we may be ignoring our hunger and we may not be really achieving that fullness, depending on our approach. This is not meant to be a blanket statement. But that can really override our hunger and fullness cues. And so this could lead to things like poor body awareness and poor emotional regulation as a result. And so this can also create this experience where we don't know if we're physically hungry or full. And so it can make it difficult to understand the feeling in our body. And some people may argue that this could tie into the inability to describe your emotional feelings as well. And that could lead to, emotional dysregulation. Other things like depression, chronic stress, fatigue. So especially if we're getting less than 5 hours of sleep, that may increase our hedonic drive for food. And when I say hedonic, this relates to seeking food for pleasure versus for survival. Also, after just one night of poor sleep, we may experience changes in our hunger hormones. So the hormone that helps to keep us full, we may be downregulated. And the hormone that stimulates hunger and gets us to eat, maybe upregulated after one night of poor sleep. And so a lot of times when we're walking through like an emotional regulation toolkit, one of the questions is, have I been eating enough? But also have I been sleeping enough? Do I notice that this comes out a lot more if I am consistently not getting enough sleep, or even after one night of bad sleep? In addition to the actual changes to our hunger hormones that happen after a night of poor sleep, not getting enough sleep is a stressor, and it can also prevent us from recovering from the stressors in our life, sort of leading to, again, that chronic, long-term, unmanaged stress. So sleep is super, super important. A few other things that may make someone more susceptible: poor gut health. So specifically, our gut bacteria actually play a role in the metabolism of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that is sort of involved in this reward experience. And so if our gut bacteria is off, it may actually influence our eating behavior, because it can affect our mood. Other things like the food environment. So we're more likely to overeat in response to, food related cues. Like if we are in an environment where there's a plethora of different foods. Boredom. If we're bored and our brains aren't stimulated, that could lead to, again, maybe lower levels of dopamine. Maybe we're looking for food to get that dopamine hit. And then lastly, and I think this is very interesting, perfectionism and perfectionist thinking. So there's sort of two types of perfectionism. We have positive perfectionism, where someone may be striving towards a goal and they have good adaptive skills, and they may change their goals or their strategies if they fail to achieve their standards. So this is sort of like, hey, I didn't achieve my goal, but I believe that if I did this differently, it would be attainable for me. And so we're moving sort of from like a growth mindset and a positive perspective versus negative perfectionism, which explains when someone may set unrealistically high goals that could just sort of end in failure. And that may lead them to feel anxious, depressed, shame, guilt, so on and so forth. And we see that negative perfectionism may lend to emotional eating a bit more than the sort of like positive or adaptive perfectionism. Now, I think it's actually helpful to ask ourselves, does eating actually alleviate our stress? And so on a short-term basis, if we think about these super palatable, delicious foods, they can definitely create a positive experience for ourselves in the short term. And so that may lead to improvements in mood and so on. We know that if we're chronically engaging in stress or emotional eating, that food may need to become more and more palatable in order to have that same stress busting effect. And so this is where sometimes people will say, okay, stress and emotional eating was a pattern for me during one particular time in my life. It's something I'm still doing even though that stressor is gone. And so this is where it may just become a habit for people. And sort of, again, interviewing our stress and emotional eating, figuring out, am I eating in response to stress? Or is this something that I did at one point and now it's just a habit for me. It can be super helpful for just addressing some frustrations around this behavior. All right, so moving on to how can we actually address this? So first thing that I think is always helpful is to actually ask ourselves, am I actually stress eating or am I actually emotional eating? So again, eating large quantities of food is not necessarily the same thing as emotional eating or stress eating. I do see this a lot when I work with patients and they may be under eating at certain points of the day, whether due to their schedule, just not lending to them eating at regular times or eating enough, or whether they're really busy and that sort of inhibits their ability to tap into their hunger cues. And so they may not notice that hunger until maybe the end of the day when they get home, they've, settled down after work and that hunger sort of hits them. And so in that instance, if we are physically hungry and we're eating larger amounts of food because we didn't get enough food earlier in the day, that is not necessarily stress or emotional eating. Again, this sort of behavior is going to come independent of our last meal. So stress and emotional eating, maybe you did have good balanced meals and snacks throughout the day and you're getting home from work and now we're able to unwind, and then the stress and emotional eating happens, again, independent of what we ate and how much we ate earlier. Next strategy, and this is of course easier said than done, this is not something that happens overnight, but ditching the diet mentality and avoiding restriction, if that is something that is in place for you. Even if we're eating enough food, if we're labeling certain foods as off limits, or we're telling ourselves that we can't have certain food, or maybe we can't have certain foods during specific times. So for example, like maybe we're not allowed to have a specific food during the week, but we are saying that we can have it during the weekend. Even if we're not actually restricting that food, so even if we end up having that food, this still creates a level of psychological deprivation. And so we may then overeat that food once we actually have access to it. And again, that would look like eating independent of physical hunger. So restriction around food can cause an emotional experience that lends to an emotional response. Third tip, and this is my favorite, is to build your emotional regulation toolkit. And so this is going to be really, really helpful to do when you are not experiencing a stressor. It's going to be really hard when you're in the middle of a bout of emotional eating to pause and to think, okay, what are some other strategies for me to deal with this? Maybe you have that within you, and if you do, that's amazing. But a lot of times it can be very, very helpful to think about other ways that we can regulate our emotions when we're not in the stressful experience. Because when we are in that stressful experience, we probably are limited as far as our mental capacity to sort of come up with these solutions. And so I do have a resource on this. I'd be happy to share this with people if you're interested. But even just asking yourself, okay, what are some other ways that I can alleviate this feeling? And understanding what that feeling is can be really, really helpful. So, for example, you may need a different strategy for when you're lonely versus for when you're tired, versus when you're anxious, or versus when you're stressed. I know for me, working out is a great stress reliever, but if I'm lonely, that's probably not going to be the, response that's going to help in that situation. That situation, I might call a friend or have a visit with someone. So sort of identifying what are different strategies that I can use in different emotional states. And then I always recommend writing this out and keeping this list handy, whether it's a note on your phone, whether it's an email that you send to yourself, whether it's a Google Doc, and making it accessible in those moments. Because again, when we're experiencing that stress or that emotional state, we probably won't have the bandwidth to come up with these solutions. Now, this sort of leads me to my next tip, which is creating structure can be really, really helpful for regulating our emotions. So managing our emotions is definitely going to be easier when we have habits and structure that we can sort of fall back on despite our feelings. And when we think about what a habit is really just a mental shortcut that makes behaviors easier for better or for worse. We all have good habits, we all have bad habits. But if we can sort of get into the habit of a stress management protocol, then when we are experiencing those stressors, we may not have to think about the stress management techniques as much. And so again, this is where building that list of things that you know will help you in different emotional states and maybe practicing these things proactively so that when we are in that emotional state, it can become an automatic response. And again, for many people right now, eating is the automatic response. The goal is not to eliminate eating in response to emotions from our toolkit altogether, because again, we know that eating can be in response to positive emotions like celebrations, but rather to build that toolkit of other responses so that we can manage our emotions in a way that sets ourselves up for success. And then the last tip is to give yourself grace. So if you have an experience where you do emotionally eat, beating yourself up about it is just going to extend the emotional experience. And this is where doing a little bit of reflecting, what was I experiencing? Or what was the emotion that I was experiencing? Have I been eating enough recently? Is this actually emotional eating, or was I physically hungry? Have I been getting enough sleep? What are some ways that I would like to cope with this in the future? Giving yourself grace and just focusing on being curious with your behavior is going to actually help us address this without necessarily extending the emotional experience. Again, if we beat ourselves up, it's just going to sort of amplify the guilt and the shame, and then we may sort of exacerbate this stress and emotional eating response. Okay, and again, this episode was meant to just provide a high-level overview of emotional eating. If you would like more support in this topic, I do have a resource that sort of walks you through strategies to build your emotional regulation toolkit. So this is really going to take all of the topics here and help you to implement them. If that's something that you're interested in, please message me on Instagram at sproutoutloud, or you can email me, and my email is Ali, A-L-I, at sproutoutloud.com. Don't forget to check out the show notes with some helpful links. So if you have a topic that you'd like for me to cover in a future episode, you can request that topic in the Google form in the show notes. And if you're interested in a one-on-one visit with me, you can book an insurance covered visit through Nourish using the link in my show notes as well. Don't be shy. Feel free to subscribe to my newsletter and follow me on Instagram. You can find those links in the show notes as well.